Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to the 6th episode in our intro to Java game programming. In our last video, we looked at methods and functions, and today we're going to look at probably one of the most useful tools in our toolbox for making programs and video games and all the sorts, and that is loops. So, as you can see, the add numbers function allows us to reuse this line of code. But what if we wanted to call this line of code hundreds of times? We would be sitting here copying and pasting for a while. But, thanks to loops, we don't have to do that. So, let's see. To make a loop, our very first loop we're going to talk about are for loops. And for loops are the most useful of the loops. So to make a for loop, we say for, and then parentheses, and then we'll make our brackets. Okay? Inside our for loop, we are going to write int I equals 0, and then a semicolon. This will look weird because it looks like nothing else we've done before. But don't worry, it'll be quite clear what it's doing. And then we're going to write I is less than 100, semicolon, and then I plus plus. Okay? So, what is this for loop doing? So it is going to declare a variable, an integer of I, and it's going to set it equal to 0. As long as I is less than 100, remember this is a true or false operation. As long as I is less than 100, it will add 1 to I. Now, plus plus is a shorthand writing for plus 1 plus equals 1. Right, I equals I plus 1. Okay? There are shorthands of writing a lot of things in Java. So, I equals I plus 1 will add 1 onto the variable of I. There's a shorthand of writing that, which is plus equals I. So when you're storing variables and you're adding, you just want to add it to the current variable that's already there, you can say the operator and then equals 1. Forgot to cover that in the math section, in the variable section, but all I have to do is just add an equals to it and it'll do it. So for here we want to plus equals 1, so this will add 1 to it, or you can say plus plus. Both mean the same thing. Also you can say minus minus, which is subtraction, but we're going to plus plus. Okay? So as long as I is less than 100, it'll execute this line of code, and then it'll come back up here and it'll add 1 to I at the end of the for loop, right? It'll then come back up here and see, is I still less than 100? Well, I equals 1 now. That's still less than 100. So it'll run this line of code again, and then come to the end, and it'll add 1 to the 1 to I. Then it comes back to the beginning, and now I is equal to 2. 2 is still less than 100. So it'll execute this line of code again. Let's run our program and see it in action. Now in our console, you can see it spammed out 100 times. I don't think there's 100 lines in the console, but it should have done that. Okay? So, that is very useful for printing out or for executing lines multiple times very quickly without having to copy or paste the lines of code. Now remember, we created a variable called I. We can actually use this variable I. So if I say replace 5 with I, it'll now take whatever value I is and add 10 to it. So if I run it in our console, we go from 10 to 109. Remember, this is less than 100. I will never equal 100. It'll only get up to 99. So it gets 109. And it counts all the way up. Once again, Very useful. Now the next loop we are going to look at is the while loop. So we're going to get rid of this, and the while loop is like an if statement, but it's like an if statement and can be made like a for loop. A for loop is a lot more handier than a while loop. A while loop will execute as long as what's in the parentheses. Excuse me. The while loop will execute as long as what's in the parentheses is true. So if we pass in true, this loop will never end and keep going forever. The way we can fix that, so we can say int I equals 0, I is less than 100, I plus plus, right? So this while loop will go through 100 iterations before ending. Basically a for loop. But the while loop is good for, say, if you have like a Boolean variable and then you have some lines of code that'll turn the Boolean off. That's very useful. But that's about it. The other variation is the do while. So the do goes, we put a do at the top, and we'll take our while and we'll put it at the bottom and then add a semicolon to it. So now the do while, this line of code will execute once. It doesn't matter whether or not 1 is less than 100 or not. It'll execute once. And then we'll get down to the while. And it'll test whether or not I is less than 100. If it is, then it'll go back up to the do and loop. So the main difference between the while and the do while is the do while is guaranteed to execute once, while the while loop may not execute if the method is not, if the determining factor is not met. Okay? And that will do it for our loops. I hope you guys learned something. Comment, rate, subscribe, and thanks for watching.